It's time for a ranking of the most powerful legendaries in World of Warcraft's history. From the most game-breaking to the most insignificant, the most good-looking to the worst-looking, and even the ones that change the actual course of WoW's items and class design. The first one on our list is a more contemporary legendary that's available right now to you and me and Marcelian's mom, just locked behind a wall of RNG. And that is Nazuro, the Unbound Legacy. Although early to say, the Draktyr legendary is indeed strong. It's obviously a higher item level than all the other legendaries. It does provide the stats that you want from a legendary, because it has to give you that oomph, and it has a really neat effect. Now, how strong it is in the grand scheme of things is definitely a little bit too early to say. However, the fact that it made it so far is mostly because it is the first legendary that's tied to the release of a new spec, at least lore-wise, at least thematically-wise, because Emberthal is the one that chases us, or takes us rather, to the story of Abrys chasing actually skilled Commander Sarkareth, which is the Devastator of the Evoker Trio. Hello, box. While Emberthal is the Augmenter of the Evoker Trio. So in the quest of discovering the augmentation spec for the Draktyrs and uncovering the legendary, we kind of get these two together, so it is kind of tied to the lore and enables the new spec, helping people out, helping your fellow allies to boost them in some way. Next on the list is on rank 9, or the 9th ranked legendary, which is the Legion Legendaries and the Shadowlands Unity. Now, these are tied together because of a reason. Well, mostly because all of these are, kind of legendaries in their own right, but they're not particularly amazing. They're not particularly legendaries. However, they did alter your specs / class / anything that you played to an extent that they eventually made it into the core design of said class, said spec, whether it was through an ability, a passive, a talent, or a combination of all of these. They have made it into the game because they kind of fixed some issues that the specs had or classes had at the time. As items on their own, they were more impactful than regular epics, than regular trinkets, because they did enable builds, enable playstyles, things that were so cool that players just kept wanting them inside the game, hence why we still have them to this day in a more evolved form, let's say. Moving into rank 8, we have some of the most iconic weapons in the game, such as staves and swords. But not these, because these are just chunks of wood. The actual Legion artifact weapons. They can be categorized as artifact weapons, but there's no such thing as an artifact class in the game item that we can actually obtain. They did serve let's say a higher purpose than an actual legendary weapon, but in terms of the scope of the game, in terms of the lore of the game, they were legendary weapons. I'm talking Ashbringer, Doomhammer, Kingsbane, all of those cool things were essentially legendary weapons held by legendary warriors, rogues, shamans, all of that stuff, paladins in the lore. They were held and then they were passed on to us as players. In terms of the actual power, I think it's undeniably they were very strong, clearly, but they did also come with a lot of flavor into the game. They had their traits, which were essentially the extension of talent trees that we never had ever since MoP, all the way up until Legion, all the way up until now. Actually, we didn't really have talent trees, so these were, let's say, the talents that people essentially wanted. They also came with an ability that you could put on your bars, which was very cool. They came with actual quest lines and themes for each individual spec. It was essentially the first time every spec in the game received a thematic legendary, or once again artifact if you want to go that route, weapon to empower them tremendously. It definitely innovated the game, where it was the only weapon you could loot for the whole expansion. Not to mention that most of these traits and passives and abilities that the weapons gave became also talents and spells later into the game's history. The MoP Legendary Cloak was indeed very strong, But was it to the extent of every other legendaries? Well, that's always debatable because it's relative to the time where it came out, relative to the content that was available at the time, and to the strength of the classes that were played at the time. It's definitely a nostalgic feeling that a lot of people hold dear. It gave you really nice animations. It was the culmination of an epic quest line following Rathian that enabled you to have this cloak by the end of, I believe, 5.4, when you essentially had these cloaks. It was also, at the time, the first legendary to be available to every player playing the game by design. Following the questline, you would be guaranteed to get the legendary cloak, and it served as a precedent for a lot of other things. Together with another legendary that we're going to talk about later into this video, it stood as a precedent to some of the cooler things that were going to come in the history of WoW, specifically the Legion legendaries that we just had before, because of its availability to everybody, enabling this for the first time to be something that everybody had access to. You didn't just have to like RNG loot it off of a boss or go through gruesome quest lines to get them. And it might also have been the inception of the artifact power grinding system, which was okay in Legion. It kind of degenerated over time, we can all agree to that. But as far as we know, at the time of the cloak's inception, it was that in mind that we also had the Breath of the Black Prince currency that was supposed to transform epic weapons into legendary weapons, but instead was scrapped in favor of the cloak, meaning that the cloak was part of what the devs designed to eventually transform into Legion artifact weapons.
This world is a prison.
On the 6th rank, Rachel Death's Whisper. It could very well be one of the most iconic bows in the game. It definitely gave hunters in Shadowlands a lot of power and a lot of continued power because it did stay for a very long time the relevant bow that hunters would go for even through Sepulchre. I don't remember if it was good all the way to the end of Sepulchre, but it was definitely very good for a very long time. Not to mention that after Sepulchre, when we got the Faded Raids, you had chance to, buy the upgradable tokens to upgrade the bow if for some reason you didn't have it upgradable by that time, and it was epic. It was epic because it did belong to one of the most famous hunters ever to exist in the game. It belonged to one of the most antagonized characters to exist into the game at that point. Everybody wanted to get Sylvanas down and get her bow, clearly, because she enabled the bow. Obviously came with kind of like a semi-set with the quiver, but not really. Plus, it did come with an ability. Now, the first time that the abilities came into the game were with the artifact weapons back in Legion, and although that kind of definitely set the precedent, this was essentially a legendary that came with its own ability that was not tied to an entire expansion's core mechanic that the devs would definitely play out and plan out for every class and every spec in a game. This was essentially the Wailing Arrow mechanic that Beastmasteries and Marksmanship eventually turned it into a talent that now they have in Dragonflight. In terms of overall power, it might not be the best on this list, but it definitely has a heavy lore implication. It definitely had heavy game implications, and it added an ability that became a permanent talent so far for hunters. Fangs of the Father were the very first pair of legendaries that took you through very specific class quests, rogue in this case, through epic stealthiness, assassinationiness, sneakiness, and pickpocketiness. But what the fuck, man? Give me my shit back! Fangs of the Father also most likely inspired the mob quest line for the cloak that we had earlier in this tier list, and likely the Legion artifact quest lines, some of the most class and spec thematic gameplay ever made, considering how iconic the Fangs of the Father were, being the first class specific legendary. It was giga good, well, they were rather giga goods because they came as a set, the second legendary and the last legendary to ever come as a set with a set bonus in the game so far. I don't know if we're gonna have anything in the future, but it was unique in its own right. Part of a really epic quest line that turned these daggers from epics to eventually legendaries and do all of the coolest rogue things for the first time in the game for a class for a specific legendary, even though we had class quests before. Rank 4 is Terragosa's Wrist, which to this day is still one of the most legendary staffs ever made. Staves? Dragon Wrath, Terragosa's Wrist, also from Cataclysm, was arguably even more impactful at the time, although it didn't have the in-game system implications that the Fangs of the Father had by introducing class-specific quests to culminate in a big class-specific legendary. It did bring with itself a lot of other stuff. First of all, it is probably to this day one of the most visually publicly impactful legendaries, because if you completed the staff finally in your faction's main capital city, or Orgrimmar or Stormwind, you would see the ghost or the spirit or the big fat dragon up in the sky flying over top of the capital. Everybody would see it. It was not just you, it was not just your guild. Once somebody did this, everybody could see that they've completed the staff. It was a big visible flex that people could get into. Not to mention the staff itself obviously was very strong. It was legendary by the end. And it also, when you used it, and you can still do this to this day, transform you into a dragon. A unique dragon mount that up until recently in Dragonflight you couldn't have in any other shape or form. But if you do have the staff and you do the Blue Dragonflight quest line that was added in 10.1.5, you can actually get that dragon form as a mount for your character, the one that actually has the staff. So keep your staff and do the quest.
You are not prepared.
People were definitely not prepared for when the Warglaives would finally drop. Sorry, dude. Off of Illidan and what implications they would have. Warglaives of Azeroth were probably the first iconic NPC legendary to drop. Sure, we had Sulfuras, but up until World of Warcraft, nobody really knew about Sulfuras. But Warglaives do go back in time all the way to Warcraft 3, and Illidan is a more iconic character than Ragnaros, let's be honest here. As far as the actual legendaries go, they almost made or broke the game at the time. They did come out in Black Temple. You could still play them throughout Sunwell, and it definitely made a big difference between guilds that actually used people having the Warglaives and guilds that did not. Not to mention all of the tremendous amounts of drama over people ninja looting, stealing, backstabbing other people just to get their hands on the Warglaives, and the fact that they were iconic and usable by warriors, rogues, and later on other classes as well. It was fantastic. They were so epic. I have mine. It is cool. You should definitely farm yours because now they're transmogrifiable on all demon hunters. And in terms of actual lore implications in fantasy, in terms of, you know, how popular this weapon ever was, it only comes second to Frostmourne. Although not actually Frostmourne, Shadowmourne is as close as you as a player will ever get to wielding the actual Frostmourne. And you might come up with the argument of, but hey Flame, Frost Decays get the Blades of the Fallen Prince as their artifact weapon back in Legion, which are made from the chunks of Frostmourne. Sure, okay, fine. However, Shadowmourne retains the fantasy of Frostmourne, of stealing souls. It had a unique mechanic of soul stacking up, giving you strength to give you more and more power. Not to mention, Shadowmourne was at the end of another epic questline at the time. It looks more like Frostmourne than any other blade because it still has a little skull thing that's very on Frostmourne, by the way, which is really cool. And it puts you face to face with Arthas. And here's some of the most unique dialogues you've ever heard. Essentially, Arthur saying that, you know, you're hunting souls, you're building a weapon, putting power, and how are you any different from how he was? Which at the time was very epic. Not to mention, part of the reason why it ranked so high is because, well, it was very strong at the time and completely broke the game, dude. Like, DKs and warriors that had Shadowmourne were unstoppable, specifically in PvP as well. Everybody remembers those, but thematically as well. If you keep killing Arthas with Shadowmourne, you can loot specific items that are only available to you, that are past memories or past lives, or items that are lore themed, flavor themed around Arthas, and it's so cool. So much epicness surrounding this weapon. Kind of hard to beat, except for one. And before we go to the number one, we need to talk about some honorable mentions. Maybe legendaries that you hoped you would see on the ranking, or maybe you think should be here and maybe even ranked higher than what we decided to have for you. One such honorable mention would be the first ever legendary to be dropped, recorded by a player in World of Warcraft, which is Talisman of the Binding Shard, or Talisman of Binding Shard, which was a mistake. It was not supposed to drop. It was not supposed to be owned by anybody and quickly removed from the game once it was recorded for being dropping. Once you equip this Talisman of Binding Shard, you can actually see it on your character as a transmog style item, the only necklace to this day to showcase on your character's model. Another epic, very, very powerful legendary at its time was Sulfrost, the Hand of Ragnaros. Again, even though similar to other legendaries on this list, it did come at the end of an epic questline of gathering materials, at the end of a lot of drama for a lot of people, and it was very iconic to that time, probably the strongest two-handed weapon in Classic, with a fireball effect once you hit your enemies, which was really, really, really cool. It's just not quite at the level of other legendaries that we have in this ranking. And there are a lot more honorable mentions. Essentially, the BFA cloak that was particularly very cool, a lot of heavy lore implications with the Insanity of N'Zoth. It was mostly because the system required you to have it to enable you to actually raid Ny'alotha and do the horrific vision, so that's why it doesn't rank actually on our list, since although it was a legendary cloak, it had a lot of stats, it had a lot of power into it, it had a specific effect just for the theme of the expansion. Everybody had it. Mob did it way before then. It was kind of a nostalgic throwback to the Mob legendary cloak, so it doesn't count, okay? And of course, there's a lot of stat sticks at Yesh, a Fable staff that I don't think anybody has ever seen in the game. Very big staff stick. Obviously, people looted it back in Naxxramas in Classic before it became a Wrath of the Lich King raid. We had the Aman'Thul trinket back in Argus in Legion. That was the only third legendary that you could use at the time, if I recall correctly, which is kind of also just a glorified stat stick, plus all the other Legion legendaries that were glorified stat sticks, the Warlords of Draenor rings that were an extension of the Mop legendary cloak that were just glorified stat sticks. They didn't really feel like epic legendaries, like the one
On the first place.
and that is Thunder Fury, undisputed champion, the most powerful legendary in the history of World of Warcraft. You don't think so? Hear me out. Thunder Fury came out in Classic, and it was available not really right away, but you could farm it in one of the first raids of the expansion, which was Molten Core. One of the main ideas of a legendary being powerful is how long it gives you incredible amounts of overpowered power, overpowered damage, right? Warglaives could be used all throughout the beginning part of Wrath of the Lich King endgame, while Thunder Fury was actually used throughout the Burning Crusade by tanks to still maintain huge amounts of aggro on target, because it had a sort of thunderclap effect where you did AoE damage and you slowed enemies, which was very, very strong, definitely one of the strongest for the tanks. It was the legendary to have as a tank back in Classic. You could essentially ignore all of the threat issues that were mechanically present at the time. Remember those times when you had to wait for the tank to Sunder Armor the boss? That was Warrior, because there were no other tanks in Classic. And even stop DPS because the tank didn't have enough aggro at the time. We're not going to talk about how bad people were at the time, because we were all bad, but that's not the point. The point is that this legendary offset all of that, and it was the longest lasting legendary in terms of viability and versatility in WoW's history. Definitely not intended and definitely not repeated ever since. And if you think WoW was broken at the time, you have no idea what's going on right now in Dragonflight, because the meta is completely broken by the new spec augmentation. Check this video out where we talk about how broken it actually is.